ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much and welcome to Engineers Australia on this very windy and dusty day outside, so thank you for all attending. My name is Dion Rowley and I shall be acting as the chair for tonight's events. A little bit different tonight, we have two events as such. We have our topic with our two good speakers, and then shortly after the presentation finishes tonight we'll have a short AGM from one of Engineers Australia's committees. For those of you that may not be a member of one of the three institutions, of course we'd encourage you to be so. There is some promotional information on the way out. I'm an engineer, not a salesman, but there's something that may be of interest to anybody there. If you have registered for tonight, great, thank you very much. There's a sign-in sheet, so if you're hoping to collect the CPD points as part of your professional development, please make sure you sign that sheet and that will be accredited towards your CPD profile. I should swap microphones because this one's going to give up on me, I think. Right, we should try that much better sounding one. So tonight is organised by the Joint Institutions Lectures, which is from the IEEE, Engineers Australia and the IET, who all put together to arrange the events for you this evening with the speakers. Before we start, a couple of procedures. Fire. There's no emergency drills planned for tonight, so if you hear any alarm sounding tones coming out of the speaker system, please take it as some form of real emergency. So if you could make a swift but safe exit out of the front of the building, turn left, and the RV point is in front of the Meriton Apartments, and I'm sure there'll be somebody there with a white hat on and a clipboard or something, so please check in with those. If you need any of the restrooms, they're just behind the elevators in the lobby area, so you can either use the stairs back into the reception area, or there's a door at the back which will lead you to the restrooms. If there's any first aid requirements, we have first aid kits, defib kits, etc. at the back, so please put your hand up and they'll be available should you need them. And also I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting on tonight at Engineers Australia, of the Camaragal people of the Guringai Nation, who met with their elders to discuss topical things for their community, for the betterment of their society on this land. So in our own little way, many years later, we hope that we're continuing to do that tradition. Also, many of you may know that Engineers Australia is in its 99th year at the moment, so coming up for the magic 100 years next year, and that was started by a bunch of white gentlemen, as it would have been at that time, in power, who met in our great city of Sydney to discuss whether it would be a good idea or not to have an institute, professional institute of engineers in Australia after the horrors of the First World War. So hopefully you'll agree that they came to the right decision and decided to set up Engineers Australia in that time, and obviously we'll be doing many things to celebrate the 100 years next year. Tonight's presentation is sponsored by the IET, and we're privileged to have Stuart Smith and Mitch Parker with us from Ernst Young to discuss tax incentives and grants that are available from the government relating to R&D expenditure. I'm certainly interested in listening to this. Their company has helped our company in the past with those, so hopefully you can find some interesting topics that could benefit your companies too. Stuart is a senior manager at EY and has worked at EY in their grants and incentives group for the last 5 years. Stuart is a chartered professional engineer, congratulations, having previously worked as a materials handling design engineer in the mining and mineral processing industry for 13 years at Watkins Goodman, Worley Parsons and Oricon. He has worked on a variety of projects around the world, from Serbia, New Zealand and the Philippines to more local projects in Newcastle and in the central Queensland mines. Mitchell is a senior manager at EY Grants and Incentives team, having joined in 2010. Prior to joining EY, Mitchell was a project manager and biochemist for 8 years, focusing on bringing new technologies to commercialisation. Mitchell is a co-inventor of 6 international patents, and also is involved with the protection of those processes. Mitchell applies his strong industry background to assist companies from I've obviously written that down, a range of industries including one that I can't pronounce, pharmaceutical, biotechnology and food science. So it certainly sounds like they're well equipped to discuss the topic at hand tonight. So I'm sure you've heard enough of me chattering away. So if you'd like to join me in the usual fashion to Mitch and Stuart to the stand, please.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me all right? Yep. I've been to a number of these sessions, so this is the first time though that I've had the opportunity to present. So thank you very much, Dion, for the invitation. Hopefully you can all come away with something useful tonight. So I thought I'd start just a bit of an introduction into EY and myself and Mitch. Most people think that EY is just a bunch of accountants, but we're much more than that. Neither Mitch and I are accountants, so unlike most of my engineering friends that I still keep in touch with, we are not just a bunch of accountants. Then I'll give you a little bit of a rundown on the funding landscape, what's available, what types of grants and incentives are available, and then when to apply. There's many different forms that these grants and incentives take. So knowing in advance what to apply for and when can really make a difference. I'll then run through a couple of examples of grants and incentives, and the most common one and the most readily accessible is the R&D tax incentive. So I'll go into a reasonable amount of detail on that, and right at the end there's an opportunity to ask any questions. So just a bit about myself, and Dion's already covered most of this, but I'm a senior manager at EY in the grants and incentives team. Prior to joining, at the end of what I would say the last mining boom, I was a mechanical engineer focusing on materials handling. So that's conveyor systems, bins, silos, coal export terminals and similar. Formerly at Watkins Godwin, which was just a small consulting firm, that's where I guess learnt most of my materials handling skills. Were then acquired by a much bigger company, Worley Parsons, and that exposed me to a lot of really interesting projects around the world, particularly with some of the mineral processing ones. Then I moved on to Oricon and worked at projects NCIG, the Stage 2F expansion in Newcastle. And believe it or not, straight after that there was another coal export terminal being planned called T4, but unfortunately that got shelved. And then Mitch, as Dion said, senior manager as well at EY in the grants and incentives team, project manager and biochemist, co-inventor of 6 international patents. And he's got a lot of experience in agriculture, pharmaceutical, biotech, food science and manufacturing. We cover a lot of different industries at EY in terms of what we find for grants and incentives, and keeping up to date with all those different industries is certainly a time-consuming activity. But as an engineer, before I joined EY, I had very little understanding of grants and incentives and what's available. And I think if I had the knowledge that I do now, it could have really made a difference, particularly to the smaller company I work for at Watkins Godwin. So just understanding, getting an overview is the idea of tonight. We won't go into a huge amount of detail on each one because there are just too many to cover. But hopefully you can keep in mind, as I go through this presentation, just how it might apply to your company or a project that you're working on. So a little bit about EY, formerly known as Ernst & Young, but like most of the Big Four, changed to just initials. Basically we've got 4 service lines. Assurance, which is primarily looking for independent verification that a company is doing its accounts right and any other regulatory requirements are being met. Then advisory group, I'll just skip tax for a second there. The advisory group, as the name suggests, gives advice on how a company might further grow or how they might transform businesses. And they do that by taking quite a step back and looking at all aspects of the business, and based on their experience and expertise they can give some ideas on how to transform. Then we've got the transactions group, which is mainly concerned with managing a company's capital, whether that's through mergers and acquisitions and so on, and all the implications that brings. And then we've got the tax team. So the grants and incentives team sits within tax. In Sydney, we're a team of around 25 people. Out of Sydney, about 2,000. So we're not a huge team, but we're not certainly not the smallest by any means. The reason we sit in tax is because a lot of the mechanisms by which you receive your benefit from a grant or incentive is realised through doing your corporate tax return. But having said that, very few of us join the team with any experience at all in tax or accounting, and we've got backgrounds in engineering, geology, biology, chemistry, and we do still have a few accountants and lawyers that we put up with. So why do we need that sort of background? And the reason is we need to understand what you guys, what engineers, what technical people are doing, and how that might be relevant for the regulators who might not necessarily have those backgrounds. So a lot of our job is conveying that information in an easy to understand format that still meets the criteria for eligibility. And we help engineering-based companies across both large scale and small scale. For the large scale companies, so we're talking sort of turnover of greater than $20 to $30 million. The main way we help them is with the R&D tax incentive, but also we've got a specialist team that looks at large government grants for infrastructure programs. It's relatively new to our team. Then at the other end, we've got some of the smaller scales. So this includes companies with turnovers less than $20 million, and they might be relatively new. They might even be a one-man band, a startup. And we assist those types of companies by obtaining grants, concessional loans, so lower interest rates on those loans than they might otherwise have access to. And we also do contributions to incubators. So we're heavily involved with Stone and Chalk, Tankstream Labs, which are incubators that help startups really grow their business in the first few years. So we do lunch and learn sessions and provide accelerator programs to help them through those first few years, and also make introductions, whether it's to venture capitalists or other groups within EY that can help with mergers and acquisitions, with anything like that. So it's just having those connections, and a lot of what we do is make connections and introductions to other people. So I'll just talk a little bit now about the funding landscape. At any one time, there's over 4,000 funding opportunities available, and that can come in from local, state, federal government. And the main forms that they come in are grants, incentives, concessional loans, and tax offsets. And understanding what's available and when to apply is critical, and it can really help companies to make some informed decisions about whether to pursue a project or how they should best spend their capital. But obviously with such a wide range of grants and targeting various different industries, it's very difficult to know where to start. So luckily there are a couple of websites. These two are government-based websites, including grantguru.com.au and Grant Connect, which is grants.com.au. And that's a great place to start, just for general information on what might be suitable for you in your particular situation. So the easiest way to identify whether you might be eligible for a grant or incentive is what we call the 6 project indicators. And as I go through the talk, just keep some of these in mind and how they might relate to one of your projects. So if there's anything with your day-to-day activities that is significantly above and beyond what you would normally do. So that might be capital expenditure, if you've got a large amount of money that you're looking to spend to do infrastructure projects or any other project that's, as I said, significantly above what you normally would. Or if it's something that might potentially create a lot of jobs. Government loves to sponsor any project that might create jobs. It looks good for them and it's good for the economy. If your particular organisation doesn't have the technical expertise to undergo all of the aspects of that project, you might need to collaborate. So if there's a component that you need to collaborate, and especially with research organisations, we're just talking over the sandwiches there about the fact that Australia doesn't really collaborate well with research organisations such as universities. So the more you can demonstrate that yes, we do need this collaboration, the more the government will probably be willing to help. And then we've got innovation there. If you're benefiting a wider industry group, or what you're doing is significantly new and it's looking at taking some technical risks, there's a variety of ways that you can get government assistance with those projects. The next one on the list I've got there is renewable energy. And again, just listening to the news this morning, there's all this debate about energy policy. If you're looking to do anything in the realm of renewables, or looking to undertake a project that's looking to improve energy efficiency, there's a very good chance that the government will want to hear from you, and there might be some potential funding opportunities there. And the last one on the list there is training and education. So if you're implementing something new and you need to train your employees, there are various ways that you can get assistance from the government to do that. And that's both locally and throughout Australia. But it's important to understand that a lot of these grants are not just free-for-alls, and they are mutually exclusive. So if you apply for one grant in a particular area, there might be a reason why you can't necessarily grab another grant. And if there are multiple people all looking at similar grants, it's going to be a lot of unnecessary work that is in the end abortive. So I recommend that you consult all people in your organisations, whether it's the internal finance team. They might have a good reason why they might or might not need capital to put into that project. And secondly, the tax accountant. There might be significant tax reasons that you might not be aware of as an engineer. I know I certainly wasn't. That might really affect your ability to claim. You might think you're eligible for a significant amount from the government for a particular project, but there might be reasons why the company doesn't want you to pursue that. And then I've got the public relations within your company. So if your project has some benefit to an underprivileged area or regional areas, then your PR person will probably want to know about it, and they could raise that with the relevant government minister when they're next in contact. But obviously the most appropriate grant depends on a number of things. It depends on the nature of the project. So if you're looking at anything that's tech-based, or if it's in renewables, or if it's looking to do a new factory that might bring jobs to the region, the nature of the project will significantly influence what's available to you. Secondly there, the stage of the project. If you're just trying to understand whether a technical concept can work, that will open up opportunities to a very different area to when you've actually got that product and you're looking to sell it overseas or further commercialise it. The level of spend, bear in mind that a lot of these grants are capped, or they might require some skin in the game from you guys. Now, if you're expecting just a handout and the government says, well, actually you need to have matched funding, whether that's 50-50 or providing a third of the funding, you've got to have enough to back that portion of it. So, and as I said, a lot of these are capped at say $1 million, or it might be more. So depending on the level of spend, it can determine which one is most appropriate to you. And then company structure is also important, particularly when you're looking at the R&D tax incentive, and I'll go into a bit more detail later about that. But if you're owned by companies that you might not be aware of, and they have, say, greater than 40% ownership, that can also impact on whether you get a high rate or a low rate in that incentive. So when to consider applying, I tried to generate a bit of an example that might bring in both owners, it might bring in suppliers, it might bring in consultants. So I've got this example of a CapEx project that in the early stages, when you're evaluating different options, you might have a wide variety of options, and that's enough to indicate whether one of those 6 project identifiers can be ticked. So there are various funding opportunities at the early stages to get your mind around whether it's a clean and green sort of project, or if you're looking at advanced manufacturing. And again, if you don't have the necessary technical capability within your organisation and you need to reach out, there are ways that the government can fund your collaboration. If your concept has an option in it that's looking at developing in Northern Australia, just knowing that there's a fund available to help anywhere in the northern parts of Queensland, Northern Territory and WA, that can really maybe push one option in favour of the others, if you can access that. So then when you move through to conceptual development, so that's working through your feasibility studies, you start to refine those design options, and hopefully you, at the end of your bankable feasibility study, you have a pretty good idea of what that option will be, and that's the stage when your project is better defined and you can go and apply for grants with a lot more definition that the government might require, rather than being it could be A, it could be B, it could be C. So again, anything that boosts employment or provides a broad public benefit is focused on renewables. There are various triggers there that might indicate that you're eligible for a government grant or an incentive. Then when we move on to the design phase, hopefully your design, there are no more changes, unless of course it's something like the light rail project. That's when we start moving away from your large government grants, and you might start looking at R&D tax incentives. For example, if you've got part of that is just refining and testing a prototype to see if prototype A or prototype B might be the most successful. If one fails in a normal operating condition, that opens up R&D tax incentives. On the supplier front, if you're quoting for a job and the functional requirements for this project are quite difficult, which they often are, that might mean that you have to then innovate to make sure that your product that you're offering is suitable to do the task. And that might lead to further innovation, further research and development. You're opening yourself up for an R&D tax incentive claim. Then when we move through to a build phase, so the construction and commissioning of a project, again, R&D tax incentive is probably the most applicable here. You might be, and this is from the contractor's point of view, not so much the owner, but if a contractor is looking at a different way to improve the ground, for example, when I worked on the NCIG project, they were looking what's the most effective way of improving the ground, because Kooragang Island isn't known for its stability, and so they could trial dynamic compaction or whether it was pumping dry cement into the ground. You don't know unless you can actually physically run an experiment, and that again opens yourself up for an R&D tax incentive. So then when we move through to the operate phase, this is moving back to the owner. How many times has a supplier promised the world and then you find that it doesn't actually meet the utilisation targets, or it might not reach availability, it might not even come close to reaching the throughput that was required. They were the experts, they didn't know how necessarily how it suited your organisation, and so it's left to you to see if you can further develop that. And again, even though you're in the operate phase, you can still potentially claim an R&D tax incentive. So then if we look at the other end of the spectrum and we look at an engineering startup. So this might be an engineer who has got a number of years experience in working for a larger company or a small company, and they've suddenly got an idea, they've seen how something can work better, or they see how they can develop a new product. The first stage of that journey is the ideation and creation stage, and typically you won't have any funds available or very limited funds, and you might be just a one-man band or very scant resources in terms of personnel to further develop your product or idea. The government does provide assistance for small companies if you need to put on new employees. So that's one to keep in mind. Also, at this early stage, the R&D tax incentive is still applicable, but obviously with small companies that are looking to minimise their expenditure in the first few years, you have to be mindful that there's a minimum of $20,000 spent to apply for that tax incentive. Then when you move through to the MVP, the minimum viable product, and this is a case of proving that your product actually has legs. There are funds available. The MVP program provides up to $25,000 just to get that first concept into an MVP. And again, the R&D tax incentive can still be applicable at this stage. And then if you've got a prototype, so you've got something that has technically been proven to work, but you need to prove it commercially, whether that's for investors because they won't necessarily invest unless they see that there's a real commercial benefit for your clients. So what is that market need? There are accelerating commercialisation grants, and that is just a program that is competitive, but they provide match funding to get your product from prototype to the first commercial sale. Then hopefully in this journey, the engineering startup is becoming a little bit bigger and it's time to further develop your product, whether that's every 18 months or if it's every 12 months, and you need to constantly refine that to meet market needs. So again, the second point I've got there is the R&D tax incentive, applicable at this stage as well. But in order to further develop, often these startups need additional funds, and so they might at this stage go for a capital raise. How do you make your company look as attractive as possible to your investors? And one way is to apply for the early stage innovation company status. So that's known as the E6 status. If you have an E6 status, your investor will get a potential 20% tax credit, and more importantly for them, if they've held the investment or the shares in the company for 12 months to 10 years, you can avoid a capital gains tax. So suddenly, investing in your company rather than a competitor who might not have that E6 status becomes a lot more attractive, and it really opens up more investors into your company. Then there are building partnership grants, and they are applicable for companies that are looking for that first big trial partner. So if you've got a good idea, a product that works, but you really need to test it in a company setting, there are ways that the government supports the collaboration between you and other companies to get that, I guess, commercial verification of your product. If you've got a product that is ready and you're looking to expand during this stage of your growth to overseas markets, there's a potential that you could claim up to half of those expenses back. Expenses such as overseas consultants, marketing activities, the cost of IP protection, patents and whatnot. You can apply for an EMDG grant, and they're quite popular now, so bear in mind that the rate that you get back in recent times has reduced, but I can talk a bit more in detail if you need after. And then there are landing pads, and this is where the government has, I think it's 5 now, landing pads around the world in ecosystems that are thriving for similar startups, and it's a good opportunity to put your business right in the thick of the action where other companies are also talking to suppliers, investors and so on. So this includes Berlin, San Francisco, Israel, Israel. So they provide up to 90 days in that sort of environment. And then at the final stage, when you're looking to, hopefully you're quite established and you're looking to increase your market share, you might look to some of those larger capital projects. If you need to build a new manufacturing facility, for example, because your garage out the back of your house doesn't quite cut it anymore now that you're going international. There are potentially some capital grants available, as I've said in the previous slide, R&D and some of the larger funding programs. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the landscape. I'll now go into some detail on the R&D tax incentive, which is probably the most well-known. Most of you, or some of you, might have already had experience with the R&D tax incentive, but it's a broad-based incentive, and it's probably the longest running. Started in 1987, and since then it's had a couple of different forms. The most recent change was back in 2011 when it changed from the R&D tax concession to the R&D tax incentive, and the criteria changed. So it's a broad-based incentive to encourage companies to undertake innovation, take on those technical risks to develop a new product or a new process or a new device or a new material. The legislation talks about new knowledge in those forms. So it's quite broad, and the other interesting aspect about it is it's a self-assessment regime. So as opposed to government grants, which are usually competitive, you're going up against another company saying, why do you need the funding? Why is your proposition better than your competitor? Why do you really need that extra cash? This is something that every company in Australia should be able to self-assess, see if they're doing activities that meet the criteria, and then they can lodge that through their income tax return. And it's written in a way that's accessible to all industries. So it's not just for software, it's not just for pharmaceuticals, it's agribusiness, it's mining, it's, what else have we got?
Banks, we've got everything.
Banks, pretty much covers all industries. It's a legislative program, meaning there's a law written about it that outlines the criteria, and it's jointly delivered by AusIndustry. Now, AusIndustry is a government organisation, and they look after the technical eligibility of the activities. The ATO looks after the expenditure, so there are two main aspects to it. Is your activity that you're undertaking eligible in the first place? Secondly, is the expenditure that you're trying to claim eligible? So they're largely separate, but in recent times I've seen them almost overlapping. The other thing to note is that you need to register within 10 months of your year end. So if you're a 30 June year end, which most companies are, you have the next 10 months to register. So the deadline for registration of activities comes on the 30th of April of the next year. And it's not enough to just register a project that might potentially go for 3 years or so. You have to do it annually. So you have to each year show why those activities that you've undertaken still meet the requirements. So I'll just go over a couple of the benefits here. I've broken it down into the small company and the large company. So if you're a small company and your aggregated turnover is less than $20 million, so we're looking at relatively small, you can access the higher rate of the tax credit. So that's 43.5%. Used to be 45%, but the government reduced that to be in line with the proposed corporate tax cuts that then were not in line with that. But they left it at 43.5%, which basically means if you're less than 20 million, your corporate tax rate, and the difference between your corporate tax rate and the tax credit that you get from R&D is a difference of 16 cents, 16%, which means that the net benefit to you, if you've spent $1, you get 16 cents back. If you've spent $1 million, you get $160,000 back. That's if you're in a tax-paying position. So in other words, if you're making more revenue than your eligible deductions, and you're in the tax profits, but if you're in tax losses, in other words, and a good example of this is your startup community. So they're often spending a lot more money than they are actually getting in. So they're in what's called the tax loss position. The beauty of this program is that not only do they get a 43.5% tax credit, which is higher than the large companies, but you can also get cash back. So rather than just reducing your tax, because these companies aren't paying tax, they actually get cash back from the government, which makes it very lucrative and very beneficial in looking at whether you're indeed eligible for it or not. Then we look to the large company just by comparison, and if you've got a turnover of greater than $20 million, you get the lower tax rate, so only 38.5%, which is a net benefit of 8.5%. Unlike when the small company is in losses and they can get cash back, unfortunately, if you're a larger company and you're still not paying tax that year, you can only carry forward your losses. So it's not quite as lucrative, but it still has a real benefit in future years as well. So this one's the real highlight for a small company, but it's not to say that it's an insignificant benefit for the larger ones. And we've got a number of clients that have really actually achieved their financial targets because they claim the R&D tax incentive. So the eligibility requirements haven't changed since 2011. and it's basically broken down into two main types of activities. The first one is what's known as a core activity, and that's an experimental one. So the legislation says it's one whose outcome cannot be known or determined in advance. And it's not enough just to do, say, trial and error or accidentally stumble across a result. You need to have some systematic progression of work that goes from you've got a technical idea, a hypothesis, you've got an idea of how to solve a problem that no one else has been able to solve, that you're aware of, or you don't have access to that information. Then you conduct an experiment, you draw conclusions, you evaluate it, and you and it leads to a logical conclusion at the end. To be eligible for the R&D tax incentive, you need to have at least one core activity. So that's the first thing, to identify that experiment. The next type of activity is a supporting activity, and this is where we see a lot of background research and undertaking weekly meetings to discuss, to go over on conferences to research ideas. It might be developing your test plan. It in itself is not experimental, but it's required, it's an enabler for that experiment or that core activity. So where do we see R&D in engineering? Well, engineers are probably the best place, and this is certainly in our experience when we talk to our clients, the best place to identify the R&D, because you guys are where the innovation starts. You've got the ideas and you help to see that through. And it's also where the company spends the money. That's where we see a lot of R&D tax incentives are claiming salary expenditure, so people's time and effort. The problem though is most engineers, and I was one of them when I was on the other side of the fence, I didn't see what I did as R&D. Most engineers would probably see this sort of thing, lab coats, Bunsen burners, doing hardcore experiments, or maybe it's looking at advanced robotics, something that's like completely cutting edge. But that's not actually what the legislation says, and so it's worthwhile keeping in mind that the legislation was written for companies. It wasn't written for universities that are doing these types of activities, or academia, or individuals. You have to be a company, and they wrote the legislation to be quite broad. And it doesn't mean that every company is, certainly doesn't mean that every company is identifying R&D, but it's worthwhile just considering, are the activities you're doing in some way experimental? Are they new knowledge? Is it producing something that's a new product or a new device? And is there a level of technical uncertainty? If so, then it's worth considering.
It doesn't have to be new to the world, it's just new to your own business and what's publicly available. So you do background research, look on Google, or look at a competitor. They're not going to give you that information, so you've got to go ahead and do your own background research and find that sort of middle ground and go, okay, I'm going to come up with a hypothesis and I need to do this experiment to bridge that knowledge gap. So it's just, it is a broad-based system, anyone can access it. The government's giving you money back just to basically keep smart people in Australia, grow GDP. That's the sort of program's intent. And we come across every day engineers, that's not R&D, but what are they doing day to day? They're fixing an issue. Oh, there's a bottleneck on the line. What are you doing? Oh, we just go around and fix it, customizing bits of equipment. But if you sort of sit back and sort of document it in a way and just not go ahead and just fix it, there could be potential for your company to come back and claim money. And a big one is actually people's time and effort. So it builds up quite large. There might be one engineer in the business, the X amount of salary, but it's all the flow-ons as well. So you might be included in a weekly meeting with your boss, the sales team, marketing team, coming up with that ideation and strategy, or the capital sort of background research. You might go overseas, look at look at an equipment option or feasibility, all the accommodation flights, then all the time and effort in the trial phase, all the production trials, all the waste material, all these things will be picked up. So the claim can get built up pretty quick, and we'll go into more detail what sort of eligible expenditure is, but it's a great program, and it's more of an education, I think, and that's probably where the thing today is to get educate yourselves that there is something like this, and you can go talk to someone within your business and access these sort of incentives.
And as I said, when the criteria hasn't changed, but we are seeing an increase in the level of documentation from the regulator that they require in order to prove what you did does meet that eligibility criteria. So if I just quickly scan through here what that criteria is in terms of what you need to register. So outlining what the project objectives were. Why did you need to do it? What was the objective of that project? And this is often in your existing documentation, like a business case, or a project charter, or a scope of work, or a functional specification that a client has given you, and you have to try and achieve that. Often it's very difficult, and you think, well, right, well, I'm going to have to develop something, I'm going to have to experiment. A lot of the objectives are in these documents already. Then the next criteria has to be new. So have you done competitor analysis? Have you looked at what's already available, both in terms of products on the market and the ability to know what the outcome of that experiment would be? So if there's any competitor or market analysis that you've done, if there's academic papers that clearly show that this is still a knowledge gap. Internet searches, literature reviews, technical journals, and as Mitch was saying, you go overseas, you might go to trade shows, and there's these trade shows exhibit what that current state of art is, and then that's enough to prove, potentially, that your new product is indeed new, and you couldn't know how to develop it based on current knowledge.
Just talking to your fellow colleagues, you're competent engineering professionals, so you are competent in the field, so you should have that basis of science background and following that systematic progression of work. So it's all aligned to that. So I think you guys are well equipped to sort of identify an opportunity that technically then can get the money back through this program.
And then, as per the criteria, you need to demonstrate the outcome of that experiment was unknown or uncertain. And often you might do a risk register. You might do an options analysis. So if you've got a multitude of options available to solve this problem, it's quite standard to say, well, what are the pros, what are the cons, what are the technical risks associated with these? And in all likelihood, there's not one option that says, well, this is the easy way to do it. So those options analysis clearly showed during the year that there was a level of uncertainty about what was going to happen. And you might also get statements from other engineers that you talk to, just outlining the technical risks, and that can even be in the form of an email. As long as it's dated, contemporaneous documentation. I'll just say that we are hoping that the regulator can give further guidance on the level of documentation, but as yet they haven't released anything, so this is what we would perceive as the necessary documentation to support a claim. And often if you don't have this sort of documentation, we wouldn't recommend well, it's going to be a risk if you claim it.
And it doesn't have to be the white papers. We've had clients who, take what you guys are doing, taking a photo of a meeting minutes or, email trails to and fro. Oh, I don't know how we're going to fix this. We need to go talk to someone. That's evidence. It's contemporaneous. Date stamps on your emails is a starting place.
And then the last criteria, it needs to draw logical conclusions. And that's probably one of the easiest aspects to prove through the use of a final report, or you might email your results of an experiment, and especially if you've got graphs or tables that show this is the before data, this is the after data. So the types of costs that you can include, if you've identified an eligible activity, that's the first step. Then you can say, well, what were the costs that my business incurred in developing that? And as I said, the wages and salaries component is probably the most common. People's time and effort, and that includes all the on-costs such as superannuation, payroll tax, workers' compensation. Then direct expenditure, and that's your travel costs. If you've got to do background research, if that research leads to an experiment, then you can look at claiming all those travel costs. Same as overheads, so that's your rent and electricity. You can claim the portion that relates to R&D activities. So, in other words, if you use a building and half the time you're using it for R&D, you can claim half the rent, half the electricity, much like you do your own personal business expenses. Then if you've got contract expenditure, if you need another company to undertake part of those activities, as long as it's for your behalf and not them, because otherwise they could claim, and you can't double dip, so the government doesn't want to see two different entities claiming the same project. So if you're engaged a contractor to undertake some of that work, as long as the IP resides with you and you're bearing the financial risk and have control of that experiment, then you can claim the contract expenditure. But it's a good idea to make sure that contract expenditure is really detailed in terms of what they did for R&D and what they did other. Because the ATO is currently looking at people that say, oh, this contractor who might be developing part of our software that is actually experimental, they also did our website hosting and so on. They're looking at a whole of those contractor claims. So make sure everything's quite adequately documented and detailed. Then if you're using research service providers, such as universities, those costs can be claimed. And plant and equipment, if you've got something in your facilities that you are using for R&D, you can claim a certain amount of depreciation for that, but only insofar as it's used for R&D. And again, a lot of these costs are apportioned to make sure you're not claiming more than you have to. And then of course, if you've got written off R&D assets, such as a prototype that you really thought was going to work, but then it absolutely failed and you had to write it off, rather than claiming the expense over a number of years, which is depreciation, you can write that off, and if it was used for R&D, you can get that extra 8.5%, or if it's a cashback position, you can claim that cash. And then if you're undertaking a trial, a separate trial on your production line, and or if it's in a mining environment or mineral processing, and you have to pay or you incur expenditure in getting that raw material or the energy costs in undertaking that trial, you can claim those costs as well. But if you end up selling that product, there is a mechanism to claw it back, unfortunately. So the R&D claim process, as I said earlier, you've got 10 months after the financial year end to register the activities with Ausindustry. And so you can see there, hopefully it's a little bit small, but generally where I've got that yellow line in the first on the left of the screen, that's the period that you're undertaking your R&D activities and incurring the expenditure. Post that time, you'll have to register those activities, explaining why you meet the eligibility criteria, and lodge that with Ausindustry. Then you do your expenditure that is related to those activities, and you lodge that with your tax return to the ATO. And both the ATO and Ausindustry can choose to review those claims up to 4 years after that date. So that's just a bit of an idea of the time frame with preparing and lodging and reviewing an R&D claim.
And I think we're
sorry, previous.
Okay, yeah. So, and a project can be anywhere in that time frame in a project life cycle. So it can be upfront ideation, background research, and that sort of snapshot period in time. Or it could be in the back end of it, and that feedback R&D finishing off. So it's just a snapshot in time. It's an annual process. So you can keep claiming this year on year on year going forward. So we see a lot of companies, get better at this and identifying it, and over years they incrementally get identifying more projects, activities, and we just sort of come in on an annual process and assist. So yeah.
So that's the R&D tax incentive in a nutshell, but there are other government grants, and I'll only go through very briefly just a couple of these, so there's time for questions. The funding program, the first one here is the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. And the benefit you get there is a concessional loan. If you're looking after anything clean energy technologies or renewables, anything with energy efficiency and low emissions, that might be a funding program that you might like to investigate further. And that's through concessional loans, available nationally and currently open. What I failed to mention earlier is that a lot of these funding opportunities open and shut very quickly. So even just this morning, there was a new one for defence type equipment. So if you're involved in the defence industry, there's I've been made aware of it today. Ways that you can get expenditure on equipment that might help that defence project. The next one is the Emissions Reduction Fund, and that's actually on an auction basis. So this is looking at earning carbon credit units for emissions reductions, and they're, as I said, sold through regular auctions, and that's again a national program. Then we've got the Australia Renewable Energy Agency, and that provides funding of between 100,000 and 10 million, so quite broad. That's open currently, and it's a national program. One of the first programs I mentioned at the start was the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund, and that's looking at the development of new infrastructure or material enhancement of existing infrastructure in Northern Australia. The funding requires demonstration of public benefit and the presence of an Indigenous engagement strategy, which is why it's focused mainly on the northern areas. And that's, so northern areas including Northern Territory, Queensland and Western Australia. Then the CRC programs, Cooperative Research Centres, they offer companies that are looking to solve industry-wide problems, and you're looking to collaborate with a research organisation. You can get funding for anywhere between $100,000 and $3 million. And again, that's a national program with the next round of funding due for early 2019. And the last one I've got there is more focused on small scale. So it's looking if you've got pilot research programs that you're looking to implement in advanced manufacturing, then you can get between $100,000 and $400,000 from the government. And that's, again, a national, currently open program. So that's all I had for the sort of formal presentation time. So, if,
I think it's more just probably go back to those 6 project identifiers. I think that's probably the key one to take away, and just that's the opportunity. So yeah.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was very interesting. I think one of the key learnings for me is there are so many opportunities there, and it's not clear for businesses until they engage a professional to see how many opportunities there can be in their industry. I know certainly when we've worked with EY in the past, we didn't realise all those opportunities. And like Mitch says, it's not always apparent immediately what is R&D, and you quickly find that there's a lot of activities that you can, for lack of a better term, write off towards that, because it is very valid. Okay, so we'll open the floor to some questions. I shall come around this microphone, which ranges between very sensitive and not very, so if it starts to scream away, if you can just quickly cover it up, it'll probably stop, and we'll swap it for another one if not.
Yeah, just quickly, so you're saying things like production engineering and lean manufacturing, that would be fine if you were looking at lean manufacturing techniques?
Yeah, so I work for a lot of food manufacturing clients, so any sort of 7 ways of reducing waste, that's the commercial driver, so we want to look underneath that. How are you improving that reductions and efficiency? So it's typically a manufacturing driver, it's cost, efficiency, all those sort of main commercial drivers. But underneath it, there's some element of R&D to sort of get that going. So if you're debottlenecking lines or changing an alternative input or optimizing your waste resources, selling that on, that can be a potential R&D project in itself. So, it's just being aware of it. So it's just the drivers. Yeah.
So you're like in the product development phase, like for example, the company is making the repeated product, but you are like spending a lot of time in putting new components and searching for the new components. So can we claim all the time for the research in like grants?
Yeah, it depends. If you've got that experiment, that if you're buying or taking off-the-shelf items and just configuring them in a way that they're supposed to be used, it probably wouldn't meet the eligibility criteria. But if you're taking components and assembling them in a new way, and you then have to experiment to see if it works, that's more what the R&D is about. Then once you've identified those activities, then you can look at all the time that it took to put them together. And there are various tax treatments that would probably bore you as to whether you can claim some of those tangible things. I won't go into them, but yeah, certainly a lot of the costs associated, particularly with time, can be claimed.
It's a bit like a lot of engineers. You might have a legacy bit of equipment that had a 10-year life. That you haven't got any money to buy a new bit of equipment, but you want to get it up and running with increased efficiency, say an extra 5-10%. So you go away and do your background research, looking at all those options, and there might be, if I modify an X, Y, Z, and do I think I can get to this output? That's a potential experiment and claim. And you can claim all the background research, the trial time, the customization time, and the testing and trialing of that on that production line. And even if you had like lots of widgets going on the line and they all fell off the line, all those sort of costs that you couldn't sell, those things could be potential R&D expenditure as well.
Yep, sorry.
And also, for example, for a small company, there are a lot of procedures in the government or in different industries. But in small company, if you spend some time to implement these procedures into the company, so is it comes in the R&D as well, or it's different?
Generally not. If it's not, so if you're implementing new procedures, there's not really a foundation of science under that, and it's not really testing a technical hypothesis.
So that's just for the R&D tax incentive. So there's government grants out there for training programs. I think it depends. Depending on the one, there's.
So if implementation of all those new procedures and so on means that you've got to put a new employee on, for example, Jobs for New South Wales will give you, if you're small, I think it's $6,000. I think it's $2,000 to $3,000 for a small company for every employee. And it's a very easy application. You just go to the New South Wales government, you apply, and then you get the money, I think, on the first anniversary, and then the remainder on the second. Just little ways to help.
Thanks.
Yep. Could you say a bit more about landing pads? How do you use them? How successful have they been, etc.?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not a big expert in landing pads, but it's more, it's run by the government, so there's a lot of information available from the government websites, and it's basically to put a company that's just for a short period of 90 days in amongst a community that is sort of thriving in that ecosystem. So you've all probably heard of, the Silicon Valley. A lot of the IT startups want to go to Silicon Valley because it's where they can collaborate with other professionals, get new ideas for technology and so on. So that's the idea of the landing pads, and I think there are 5.
I think it's just a bit like all these startup communities, all that collaboration, sharing ideas, that open workspace, and that sort of have the, for example, we sit on some of these sort of startup hubs and things like that to get sort of business advice on how to grow. So it's just getting that contact and collaboration, I think, and that amongst everyone who's on that same journey. So
what sort of funding is available to a company that wants to use that?
Mainly the facilities.
Yeah, and then probably like venture funding opportunities out of that as well. So think of like Shark Tank type stuff. I think sort of gives you a good sort of concept.
I've got a list of questions as well, which I'll slide the other one in here and there. With regards to timing, if a company decided, we've been doing something for the last 3 years, for example, and we haven't engaged anybody's services into checking whether this would have been a valid claim, how far back can you go, if anything, other than that 10 months? Is there an opportunity to say, hey, we started a project 3 years ago, can we kind of beg forgiveness and go backwards in time?
Unfortunately, there's a really strict deadline of 10 months. So unlike your tax return, where you can go back and amend for, 4 years or back 4 years, with the registration of activities, you've only got that 10-month window. And similarly with extensions of time with the ATO, they're often, if you can provide a good reason why you should get an extension, the ATO will give you an extension for that, lodging that tax return. With Oz Industry, they will not give you any extensions, unfortunately. So if you've missed the boat for prior years, you've missed the boat.
Right, thank you.
I have some kind of impression, especially small business, tend to be more like secretive or protective, and something like we don't want to show you this. So this kind of culture and this grant system, do they cross each other?
So So are you concerned that through the application process you're divulging sensitive information? We've got, it's a company that is looking at some pretty high tech and very secretive information, and even the documentation, so I'll be clear, when you register, you don't actually divulge or you don't give them any documentation to support it. So my slide regarding what's required, that's in the event that they come back and say, please prove what you've written for your application actually occurred. Through the application process, you just describe the activities. If there is sensitive information, you don't necessarily have to divulge that. But you would need to give enough to say what the story is and how it meets the criteria.
And they can't release anything, it's all under government protection and all that sort of business. So.
It's quite a common concern.
Yeah, and we've got like big defence clients, we've got all sorts of things. So it's a pure registration process, and we de-risk those, I suppose, and that's what depends what the client wants, really.
The sort of popular literature will tell you that not every product succeeds. So if you're a startup and you build a product and it really doesn't work, are you still going to get all of the government support up to the point that you finally decided it's failed?
Yeah, definitely. So that's the whole intent of the program. So that's why they're targeting SME space, and that's what they're trying to do. Is the mechanism of getting that cash back at 43 cents and a half in the dollar, basically, is that you're taking that cash out of that sort of carry forward loss. So they're trying to push you ahead to get into more of a tax paying position. So it's the timing thing, but you get that cash, and we have so many sort of startups who this is their lifeblood. So you've incurred 100 grand in R&D expenditure, you get 43 grand back through your tax return. That can get you going for that next 6 months. So yeah.
That's again another very common question we get. But it didn't work. Can I still claim it? And the answer is, well, let's check the legislation. The legislation says nothing about success of what you're trying to do.
And the hypothesis is proven wrong. Actually, the easiest R&D ones are the lemons. The things don't work. Why are you going to invest in money? So they're the actually easiest stories to register, not the ones which, oh, this was easy, it happened, it worked.
What you can't claim is when a contractor hasn't built it properly. That's quite a different risk. Certainly not a technical one.
Yeah, commercial risk. Yeah.
Question on eligibility, probably going to Stuart with regards to CPD. So, for example, Chartered Professional Engineer CPD requirement. CPD in our world would indicate new ways. How was this applicable to improving my ability to do my job? So there'd be some synergies then between an engineer's CPD activities and the eligible claim factors.
Absolutely. And again, the main thing you need though is a core activity. So if that involves, this would essentially be your background research. So, I mean, I've been to a number of these presentations and it really shows what's the state of the art there. Where better to find that than an Engineers Australia presentation?
Thank you. Any other burning questions? Time for a couple more.
Am I clear that if, for example, you have a company that's not doing anything related to what you want to experiment about, is it still claimable, or is that not considered to be related to a core activity?
Yeah, so the criteria for a supporting activity, so if they're not doing the experimentation, is that correct?
Yeah, no, if they're not doing any experimentation and then they want to start doing something in a different field of engineering, is that allowable then, or is that a totally different thing? It would be like a complete startup from scratch.
Yeah, if it really depends on those activities. So I always go back to the basics of what is that criteria. If they're doing an experiment, it's only for that period of time that they're undertaking those core activities. Then you can, I often explain it as being bookmarking. So you've got your supporting activity comes at the start, then you do your experimentation. Then if they say, no, we're going to change and do a new line, There might be a bit of project wrap-up that might also be supporting, but that's your defined experiment. If they then go and do a new line of research, that's a new core activity. So it doesn't necessarily mean that what they're doing can't be claimed, but it has to meet that criteria.
Okay. And do you also get involved with patenting, or is that something outside your field?
Not our group, but we have people that in EY does some of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think more on an engineering side of things, it's like, there might be an engineering concept or a new design that's worked in this certain condition, but it hasn't been applied in this scenario or different environment, and that's that difference in that control versus variable, that uncertainty gap, and that's why you need to go ahead and do that testing and trialing. So.
The questions out there, yeah.
You mentioned advanced manufacturing. What's classified as advanced manufacturing?
Very broad. It's a lot of, like, let's just say, look down in Victoria with the car manufacturing. So there are a lot of grants were, lots $50, $100 million grants trying to keep jobs within that area. So any sort of manufacturer in that area and pivoting into, I think one example would be, I don't know, a plastic manufacturer was doing plastic bags and now they're doing respirators or something. So you're jumping above the capability of what your plant would do and pushing it into new realms, I suppose.
And often things like carbon fibre is a key one I was reading about today, that's subject to one of these advanced manufacturing. So industry manufacturing techniques that aren't really commonly used around the world, that would be considered advanced.
It depends on the program. So all these grants have different merit criteria. So it depends on what and how competitive it is and what's available. So.
Two here.
Hi. Can you explain more on the 10 months period? Say if you have an idea, like it's goes for a period of time, then you put it in paper. It's for a long period, right? If it is not a big company, it's a small one. So how that I didn't get the 10 months.
So don't worry about the 10 months. It's like basically when your activity had taken place throughout the financial year. So let's say you had an idea in January, as an example, and you did your background research. That's an activity. Then you go, oh, well, I'm a startup. I've got to still do some other. It's not R&D. You come back in March.
Yep.
You might do it for another month. So it's just about documenting all the time and effort throughout that financial year, and then you collect it all together and through your tax return, and that's how you get your mechanism of your money back.
Yeah, very few large projects by large companies are undertaken in a year. So the registration form allows you to say, when was this project going to start and when's the forecast completion date, and what's really not uncommon is to keep on extending that. The way you can extend it is just by altering the next year. You say, no, this still wasn't realised or resolved, this problem, we're still undertaking, and these are our plans for the next few years. But you still need to actually register what happened during that year.
Yeah, big
doesn't have to be completed though.
Yeah, big engineering projects, you might be that upfront initial design, feasibility, planning, up to sort of final design, and then it might take 3 years to actually get things together, and then you switch back on into R&D mode. You can start claiming again as well.
Question about software development. If you develop a new app or a tool, how does that fit into this?
Yeah, we've got.
That's probably the hottest topic at the moment in the R&D tax world. Software, the regulator has their opinions, that's Oz Industry, on...
I think, does he want the tool to assist in R&D or actually software as R&D? What was the question? Was it more...
You're developing a product, but it's a software product.
Yep, okay, yep.
Yep. So that still meets the criteria. The thing that the regulator is currently looking at is whether it actually constitutes an experiment. And I would say, what percentage of our claims would be software?
Over 50%.
Over 50% of the claims we do are software related.
Yeah.
But it has to be a significant, and this is not necessarily our opinion on the eligibility, it's what we're seeing the regulator. And so we would advise our clients, this is a potential risk. If it's not really a technological advancement in software development, and we always alert back to the ATO's tax alerts, and that's all we can go on. They say specific things about what they do and don't see it as being R&D.
Yeah, I think it goes back this because the law is based on the scientific method. Software development, we try to link it to the Frescati model. So any of those sort of six key areas in software design and development, that's what we try and link it to. So that's probably the way we get around it, I suppose. But yeah.
And if it helps, Chris, I had a company with software development, and we were helped along the way for claims for that. And not only the software development that was done in the office was eligible, the travel of various employees interstate to actually test that software and trial it on site, that was all very valid for that claim as well. So it was a lot more than just what was done in the office. It was all the interact with the employees and their salaries and things during that period of the project.
So really the development is treated like any other manufacturing process, except it's dealing in an intangible form.
Yeah, so people's time, and even if software developers are intangible, capitalised, even if it's capitalised, you can bring that up forward up front through the R&D tax incentive. So in the software world, it's actually a real big benefit of picking it up in that year, that full amount, I suppose, of it, instead of like a 3-year sort of depreciation, I suppose, for an intangible asset. So you can claim it all up front in that 1 year as well.
Again, the important thing is making sure you document that experimental process to support your claim during the year, not after.
Was there a question on this side anyway? Did I miss a hand? Or okay, I shall go to one final question over here, and then we'll probably leave that as the last one, unless there is a real burning question. Please put your hand up.
You talk about the businesses. I just want to talk about the individuals. As we all engineers came here after our work hours, so is it something we can claim for whatever we are self-study sort of things outside the jobs, during taxes? Or?
Yeah, so one of my slides I showed the R&D tax incentives for companies. So that's the first eligibility criteria. You need to be a company. If you own your own company and you're undertaking, even if it's after hours, and you're undertaking the activities for that company, you then need to make sure that you're showing that you've incurred expenditure. So if you're doing it for free for your company, you can't really prove that actually incurred expenditure.
Yeah, it's incurred costs through the P&L. So,
Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That's kind of the end of the formal part of tonight's presentation. I hope you found it informative and interesting. We probably, like I say, it's the end of the formal part, but I'm sure Mitchell and Stuart would welcome any individual questions you have at the front. So really all that's left for me to do now is to thank everybody who's brought the lecture to you this evening as part of the Joint Institutions Lecture Series. That's the Auditorium staff. I've just seen the lady walk around the back, and the admin staff. Obviously there's quite a lot of organisation to do with that, and of course for Stuart and Mitch. So if you'd like to join me in the usual way to make your appreciation known.